Well, Lisa, it looks like we're just about 2 minutes past the top of the hour here. So maybe we'll get started. I'm sure other people will be joining us. Welcome to everybody that's joining us. Thank you for taking a little bit of time, I'm sure, out of what are some busy schedules as we're entering into the final part of this week and last week of September. Nice to see so many familiar names on our list here, and we're expecting about 40 people to join, many of whom may just be receiving the webinar recording after we're done, but we're certainly glad to spend a little bit of time talking about the KonTerra Inventory Resilience Builders, which at KonTerra we call the KIRB. And so I am Tim Calvey. I'm the senior consulting psychologist here at the KonTerra Group. I've been with KonTerra now since 2012 and have been working in the humanitarian sector for, gosh, I think the last 20 years. I'm starting to date myself. And it is really our honor and privilege to spend a little bit of time talking about this new assessment tool. And Lisa, before I jump in, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Tim. I'm Lisa McKay. I'm the KonTerra Group's Senior Training Advisor, and I've been affiliated with KonTerra since 2010, and have also shockingly been affiliated with humanitarian work and in this field for about 20 years now as well. So it's my great joy to partner with Tim and others in the group in the work that we do. And Tim and I are excited to be here today to talk to you about the KIRB and to dig into some of the questions around assessing resilience. So thanks for joining us.
And we'd love to hear in the chat box if you feel comfortable and have access, just to put in the chat box where you're joining us from. It's always nice when we have a global community that comes together in this kind of virtual space. So what we hope to achieve in the next 45 minutes is really just to introduce you to the KIRB, why it exists, how it can be useful for individuals and teams. And we're going to talk about some of the innovations that we've been able to create and hopefully create value and true meaning for our clients who are engaging in this new tool. And we're certainly going to leave about 15, 20 minutes at the end so that we can address your questions. So thank you so much. And we look forward to proceeding now. And thanks for everybody that's joining from, looks like, some wonderful places around the globe.
It is. Thanks so much. All right, I might kick us off then. I see Pennsylvania, North Carolina,
Yes.
Nigeria, Lebanon. Okay. All right, to give you an introduction as to why the KIRB exists, I'll just tell you a brief story because we all love stories. And the story is that several years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, we at KonTerra were hearing an increasing number of clients asking for a tool or for us to help them identify a tool that they could use to help staff deploying to emergency and disaster responses or working in other high stress roles assess their resilience and plan for ways to maintain well-being under pressure. And our clients wanted, quite sensibly, they wanted this tool to help staff better understand and reflect on their current levels of stress and resilience. They really wanted this tool to be able to help inform practical, pragmatic action planning. And they wanted this tool to be suitable for use with individuals from a wide variety of cultural and language backgrounds. So we set out to hunt down a tool that could tick those boxes. And what we found when we considered a long list of tools, including the Connor Davidson, also called the CD Risk, the Arsenal, a number of other tools. And if you're interested in that list, drop me an email and I can share the list of the tools that we considered. There were about 15 of them. But what
Mhm.
we found after a review of the existing tools that were available was that many of those tools too narrowly defined, in our opinion, resilience as a mental construct, linking it heavily to perspective, outlook, and attitude. And although we all know that there's a big mental component to resilience, we wanted something that went beyond just thinking about resilience as a mental construct. Very few tools attempted to measure actual behaviors or behavior frequency. Very few tools explored beliefs and practices that foster a sense of meaning, purpose, and hope, something that we often talk about as spirituality. And most of the tools were not action oriented and did not lend themselves easily to helping people consider ways to build resilience after taking the tool. And finally, none of these resilience focused tools explored something that we really also felt was important to bring into the discussion, and that is high risk coping. So none of these tools explored substance use or other high risk coping strategies. So when we looked at the lay of the land and we looked at these limitations, we at KonTerra decided that we wanted to develop our own tool that might help address some of those limitations. And Tim is going to talk us through a little bit more about the KIRB and the process of developing it and where we headed with that desire now.
Thanks, Lisa. And I had the great privilege and honor of working with Lisa and two of our colleagues, Lynn Kripe and Raven Ellis, in creating this. We were our own working group, and we've spent several years really trying to look at the research, create design the assessment tool. We had a pilot study where we were able to really get information about the different constructs that we were measuring, get feedback from our clients who were folks that represented so many different cultures, backgrounds, contexts. And so we really were able to refine that and come up with what we call the KIRB 2.0. And so as it is today, the tool is a 90 item assessment, really designed to help individuals understand and really reflect on those behaviors, as Lisa just mentioned, and try to look at 10 key areas that we see as really important factors, the foundation of resilience. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about those factors shortly. And as Lisa mentioned, one of the things, just because of the context of so much of work that we do in the humanitarian sector, in the international development sector, when we're working in high operational stress environments, high threat environments, that oftentimes some of the ways that we are coping with that stress might be more in the realm of just creating some self-comfort. And we're going to talk a little bit about that self-comfort strategy sometimes can lead us down to a path where it's actually decreasing or harming our resilience. So that's what we call high-risk coping. The tool itself really is easy to administer for folks to, do it on their phone, on their laptop, and it takes just about 10 to 15 minutes. And we were very thoughtful in how we were crafting those different items to make sure the language was approachable, appropriate across many different cultural contexts. So what exactly is the benefit, as you can see here, what we're trying to measure? But really, we're just trying to, again, help people take resilience not from that mental construct, but to help them think about some actionable insights, ways to help them think about ways that they're coping, develop some self-care plans, and to really enhance their resilience that really looks at both their strengths as well as where some of their growing or growth edges are. And so we're helping people to gain awareness, thinking about where their strengths lie. We're helping them to identify patterns that might be leading to a decrease in their resilience, things that are maybe not helping them, get back into a place of recovery after a sustained time of pressure and stress. And then for those that may be using this tool over the course of, a year, they can really monitor their progress. And we'll talk a little bit about how we've seen some wonderful ways that clients are using it in sort of a pre and a post-deployment model approach. So obviously, we're talking about resilience. That's a really important term. We've heard it for years and years now. And I'd just be curious in the chat box if you had one word or one image that comes to mind when you think about resilience or try to explain it to others. We were very thoughtful. We were trying to really, together as a working group, look at what a good definition of resilience is. And it really, as it's listed here, is thinking about our capacity. We know we live in stressful times. We know the work exposes us to great deals of pressure, sometimes vicarious trauma. And so we really want to be thinking about what's the sustainability of us working in these contexts. And when we do cross that threshold, when our stress has pushed us to a place where we're feeling depleted, what is our way of recovering? And so that's why we're really getting into the actual behaviors, the choices we make, the habits that we want to put in place that help us, again, think about emphasizing our sustainability and our ability to recover. So looking at kind of where we had the 10 factors, The very first five, I call them sort of the foundational pieces of resilience, those pillars of our health. And we're using here some of the ideas that come out of, you may be familiar with Lisa Feldman Barrett's work around the body budget deposits. And so when you think about, getting adequate sleep, eating nutritious food, am I drinking enough water? Am I getting enough physical activity in? Spending that quality time with our loved ones, and just taking time off to simply enjoy life, find joy, to de-stress. All of these actions, all of these habits are like deposits we put into a bank that help us to replenish our resources so that we're not acting in a sort of a deficit model. And so I think it's important that we're always focusing on this. And sometimes when people are talking about resilience, this is the place where they immediately go to. So I don't know if anybody put anything in the chat there. So maybe some of the ideas of resilience are falling more into the pillars of health. The next five, I think, are really interesting because they kind of bring a little different level of nuance to resilience. They're looking at key choices, attitudes, perspectives. So we're talking about the boundaries that we need to maintain or to set up or to let go of at different times in our lives. We're talking about how do we regulate our emotions when so much is asking us to be almost in an autopilot mode of fight, flight, freeze? How do we regulate our response and pause to think about how we react to the stress around us or to people that are feeling stressed? How do we adaptively cope during a crisis, particularly? How do we find meaning and purpose, which is such an important piece that oftentimes in the work that I do supporting folks in the humanitarian sector, that when they are, facing unbelievable suffering in the world, things don't seem to ever change and the world becomes a little more broken, that sometimes our meaning and purpose show signs of distress. And then finally, how do we maintain that sense of gratitude, that positive outlook on life? Just a short story. Recently, I was doing a workshop training with a group within the democracy sector. And I was presenting them with the different factors, looking at both the pillars of health, those five body budget deposits, but also looking at these five critical factors. And one of the participants thanked me at the end of the workshop because he said, Tim, I'm so grateful because oftentimes every resilience session I've ever gone to goes immediately to what I'm eating, how I'm sleeping, how I'm exercising. And I have a great deal of shame around that. And I tend to shut down when people are asking me to reflect on those particular resilience factors. But in being able to look at the ways that I am coping through stress, through adaptive ways of coping, the ways that I have the ability to regulate my emotions so that I'm creating a calm environment for my team members. Those are my strengths. So thank you for helping me have time to reflect on that. I do have places of strength in my resilience toolbox. And now I feel a little bit more open to the idea of looking at maybe improving my sleep. So I just wanted to just highlight how getting at resilience from different lenses, from this holistic approach, it oftentimes creates more opportunity for people to reflect, that it just is more approachable for so many of us that are dealing with stress and resilience day in, day out. Finally, the last thing I wanted to share that's unique to the KIRB and that KonTerra sees in all of the work that we do with our clients is that a very human way that we cope often is those self-comfort mechanisms, right? So as the weekend approaches, I'm sort of looking forward to just plopping on the couch, having a little bit of apple pie and maybe binge watching something on Netflix. And so while those things are easy for me to kind of detach and decompress, oftentimes for many of us, we might choose one coping mechanism that can often lead down a path to, really actually decreasing or harming our resilience. So think about those folks that might choose that one glass of wine that turns into three, or maybe I just want to do a little online shopping and all of a sudden I find, boy, oh my gosh, I've overspent for the month. Or I'm sure there's a host of different behaviors that each of us could name that might put us more into that, boy, that's a little risky. It actually isn't helping me build resilience. And so the KIRB assessment tool, Lisa, if you go to the next slide, just offers some different examples. Again, very human, not to be judgmental, but just gives folks that are taking the assessment some ideas when they're thinking about their own perhaps high risk coping. We're not in any way in the assessment asking them to, you know, detail or to break their privacy or ask them about these specific behaviors. we're thinking about more in sense of how is their relationship to the behavior they have in their brain and their mind and their conscious at that moment. Do people around me express any concern, or do I have concern or shame around why I'm choosing this behavior? Or what would I do differently in the future if I could reduce my dependence on this particular action? So again, we're helping to people, helping to normalize this experience without directly assessing it, but it gives them an opportunity to reflect on it in a new and private way.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the KIRB assessment report. So after you take the KIRB, which as Tim mentioned, you can take on your phone, you can take on a web browser, it takes about 10 or 15 minutes. What happens next? So what happens next is you receive your KIRB assessment report. And that report gives you some insight into your stress, high risk coping, and resilience factor scores. So you get a score on each of those dimensions. It also gives you a visual guide to your current resilience profile, because we find that visual guides tend to just land differently and make so much more sense than a list of numbers. And we'll talk, I'll show you an example of that visual spider chart guide in a minute, and we'll talk through that. And it gives some detailed advice on building resilience in growth edge areas. So those factors that you scored the lowest in, we talk about those as our growth edge areas, where there's probably the most room for us to think about what are our rhythms and habits in those areas, and are those rhythms and habits that I feel comfortable with, or are those areas where I would like to see change, and how might I think about approaching that change? How we all know that it's one thing to identify changes that we would like to make, and it's another to cross that magical bridge between theory and practice, right? So we also have some input in the report, and we talk about this aspect in workshops about the KIRB and in individual consultations about the KIRB. How do we make change? How do we go about making changes as humans, with all our fallible human quirks? So how do we bridge theory to practice? How do we form self-care habits that endure? How do we break habits we might want to break? And it gives a list of additional resources so that people have some idea of where they can go next if they want to start digging deeper. So here's that visual guide, a spider chart that I mentioned. And this is an example profile that you might see in the KIRB report. And Tim, I might toss the ball to you and say, when you see this profile, what are some of the things that you notice that you might be curious about if you were having an individual consultation with the person who received a report with this profile in it?
Yeah, Lisa, thank you so much. And I think this is the visual tool that in the coaching part of the KIRB, I really just love because I can start with their strength. Let's look together at this. And what do you see as your real go-to strength in this in this particular individual? It's positive outlook. So I might engage with it. Tell me a little bit, how do you keep a positive outlook? What does that look like? What are those specific actions that you do that help foster that on a daily basis? Because I'd love to learn more about that so I can share that with other people who may have that as a particular area of growth and opportunity. We also might take a look at how meaning and purpose shows up as a particular strength for them, and how do they maintain that? How do they currently, continue to live out their values and feel that they're making a difference in the world and finding real purpose in what they're doing? And then once we identify those strengths, we can begin to then think about, okay, so where do you see right now is your place that might be an opportunity to make some new choices? And obviously right now, sleep is showing up as perhaps their top growth edge. And so let's explore that. Tell me a little bit about your lived context. Are you, in an environment right now where, sleep is really hard because you're asking to work, very long hours. Perhaps you're getting a lot of tasks coming from a different time zone, or perhaps you're just really, recently been having trouble with a lot of ruminating thoughts. So it just invites them to reflect a little bit more deeply about perhaps something in a lived context, invites them to make a change, or gosh, right now you don't have the ability to get a lot of sleep just because of the environment you're in. Let's not put too much emphasis there. Let's look at the next category. Physical activity, what does that look like? Is that possible where you are? So again, it gives them some autonomy, some choice, some voice and control about where they would like to begin to build out that spider graph to have a little more balance.
Thanks, Tim. And speaking of balance, this is a sneak peek of something that's included in the report. So when we give people the spider graph, we also give them a nudge as to ask them to reflect on what shape does your profile line make. So looking at that issue of balance and thinking about whether and how our graphs resemble a circle or where we see those peaks and dips and how much of the graph is shaded in. So thinking through those can also open up doorways for people to consider where their strengths are, as Tim mentioned, and then how they can leverage those strengths to make changes in areas they might want to make changes in. And so we have a bunch of questions for reflection and discussion in different sections throughout the report. And these are some of the questions that are included for reflection in this section of the report. So, how have your strengths and your choices in these areas helped you to be resilient? Um, and I think it's really important, Tim highlighted this so beautifully, that holding together those, our vision of our strengths and our growth edge areas. Because too often I think we do jump straight to the negative, and the negativity bias wires us to focus on that. Sometimes when we flip into problem solving mode, we always go straight to the problems rather than taking a breath and pausing first to think about strengths and then how we can employ those strengths in problem solving. So I think holding those two together is really important. So how we use the KIRB with clients at this time is we allow clients to take the KIRB often in teams, or as Tim mentioned earlier, in a pre or post deployment situation where that would be an individual. But teams can take the client and then participate in, often the team setting, we would be looking at option 2, which is a group debrief or a training session. So everybody in the team is invited to take the KIRB, and then they are invited to participate in a 90-minute workshop where we talk through some of the things that Tim and I have just touched on in this webinar. And we guide them to think through their results, through their report, to consider resilience more deeply. We talk about that self-care, self-comfort, self-sabotage continuum, and how self-sabotage links to high-risk coping, and how high-risk coping is a very, very normal part of life. We all do it. And how we can build out our awareness of those areas where we're particularly vulnerable to losing balance with our self-comfort and slipping further into the self-sabotage territory. The other option for using the KIRB is to take the KIRB and then participate in a 1-hour individual confidential consultation. And we really love using the KIRB this way. I mean, we love using the KIRB many ways, but this way allows us to have those really personal conversations where you get to sit down with a resilience specialist on our roster, someone who spent time getting to know the KIRB, and they get to have a conversation with you, similar to the conversation that Tim just dipped into briefly, where you look at your strengths and you look at your growth edge areas and you look at what might be fueling that, and you look at your context, as Judy highlighted in the chat, like what is your context and what is fueling that low score in sleep or nutrition or whatever it is, and how do you feel about that, and how when you think about that theory to action link, like where do you feel hesitations and boundaries and barriers and the things that inhibit you from thinking about change productively. So those conversations can be so rich and really powerful in setting people up to then make actual changes off the back of this tool. So the report and the follow-up sessions are designed to help you learn more about stress and resilience and to reflect on and discuss all those things we've highlighted. So what are your key contributors to your current stress levels right now? And how much have you been using high-risk coping strategies to manage stress? So as Tim mentioned earlier, we're never putting someone on the spot and asking or expecting them to name the high-risk coping strategies that they might have in mind when they complete the KIRB in a workshop. They don't have to name them in a consultation if they don't want to. The conversation is structured in a way that just normalizes the reality of high-risk coping and invites them to think about the role of high-risk coping in their life and their relationship to their preferred self-comfort strategies, their current resilience building strengths, areas for improvement, and again, that self-care priorities and action planning, and tackling that in a way that hopefully sets them up to make meaningful change. So here's
Lisa,
just,
if I
yeah,
could
go
just
ahead.
add to, I think one of the important things that we were very sensitive and mindful about when we were creating this assessment tool is it's not meant to be a diagnostic tool, a clinical tool that, gosh, is this person, you know, almost like a fitness for duty exercise. That's not the intention here whatsoever. And we really wanted it to be something that is about exploratory and helping people to more deeply reflect on, you know, these factors that really help contribute to our resilience.
Thanks, Tim. That's a really important point. And I'm moving towards the last two slides now. We're very shortly going to open it up for questions. So if you've been sitting on a question, as I just saw one pop into the chat, put them in the chat and we will very shortly start answering those questions. So the KIRB and the individual consultation services, you take the KIRB, you receive your assessment report and you participate in that one-on-one confidential consultation that I talked about. And the KIRB and the training services are you take the KIRB, you receive your assessment report, and you participate in a workshop with peers to learn more about the topics that we flagged: stress and resilience, results, self-care priorities. So we can send any of you who are interested more information on those services. There's also a great page on our website that helps you explore KIRB and the services. I'll drop the link to that in the chat while Tim, if you could pick up on any questions that have come in the last minute or two while I've been talking, and I find that link, and then we'll start to answer questions.
Great. Well, thank you all for you know, putting together your questions. We'll continue to monitor that on the chat box here. So the first one from Jane. Thanks so much, Jane, for raising this. So our reports shared with employers. So really important that one of the things we really want to stress with staff that are taking this, particularly on the individual KIRBs, is this the results, the report are confidential. We have a confidential way of sending that to them individually. In no way is it shared with their employers. So we really want this to be a space where people find psychological safety and find, you know, that they can enter into these conversations. I think anytime you hear assessment and employer, gosh, is this going to reflect in any way in my job security? And so we really try to, in all the ways that we're communicating with an individual throughout the process, letting them know about the confidentiality and privacy of this. When it comes to the team approach, I think one, we're always working with the employer to kind of think through, you know, how do we want to engage everybody around a team around their KIRB? We want people to feel that they don't have to share. We don't share large results. But we will think about whether we're going to put together some aggregate data. How large is the population of the team and the organization? Is that something that we want consent to share the aggregate data with the employer? So Lisa, I'll stop there because I know you have more experience than I do working with kind of the larger team efforts there. And I'm curious how you've had those conversations with organizations.
Sure. If I veer off track, I just missed the very last part of that because I was realizing someone has their hand up. So Linda, we'll get to you in a minute. I'll answer Judy's question as well, and then we'll allow you to talk, and would love to hear a question. So I think, Tim, the question was using the data with organizations and having those conversations, what we report on and how we have those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So with a team approach, when the team takes the KIRB, no one's individual results are ever reported to anyone in management, anybody actually, apart from the individual. But if there's a certain number of participants in the team, we will look at the aggregate data of the team, and we can report on the average KIRB factor scores, the average stress level, and the average score on high risk coping, as long as we have enough N numbers in the group to ensure that we're protecting individual confidentiality. And people, managers and leaders who have done this with their team, we're noticing are both fascinated by the data just because of what it says about people's shared growth edge areas and where they might want to open up discussions about those topics with their team. They're really helping use the KIRB results to inform staff care planning for future years. And this is something I've been so excited to see. So we have one team now who next year will be on their 3rd year of taking the KIRB, the same teams across years. And in the last couple of years, they have used the results of the KIRB to really help them pinpoint where they want to do professional development around resilience and staff care for their teams around some of those growth edge areas, and do some deep dive discussions about the topics that the KIRB highlights. So I might leave
Great.
that there. Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Tim.
thanks, Lisa. So just for Judy's question about how much context is asked about with the KIRB, great question. Usually that first consultation with the individual when they've received the report is an opportunity for the resilience specialist to ask more about their work context, their workplace context, their personal and professional life. If we know that the particular individuals are from a certain team that has a certain role or function, we might have that prior knowledge. For example, if we know an organization might be using it in the context of pre and post deployment, we'll want to learn a little bit more about what are the types of contexts that this group is deploying to, how long are they there, are they unaccompanied, all those sorts of things that give us more context, so that when we're looking at their spider graph and preparing for that conversation, okay, that context really helps me understand where this person's been living recently. Beth, it was asking, what are the costs for individuals as well as teams?
Yes, and if anybody would like, we have a pricing flyer. It'll be easier to send that to you. It's got some additional information. Drop your email in a chat or reach out to Tim or myself or the info address, and we will send you that pricing flyer straight back with all the different individual costs and bundle costs and opportunities for that.
Yeah.
And then over time as well, those options will open up. We're exploring new ways to bundle and use the KIRB over time as well. So we have a question here. If the team size is small, could you advise on improvements that need to be made or recommendations without sharing the data and compromising confidentiality? Tim, do you have I have a few thoughts on that, but I want to open it up to you.
Yeah, well, first of all, Sleet, thank you for that question, and I so appreciate how sensitive you are to wanting to protect, individuals' confidentiality. Obviously, in no way do we want this to be an unsafe experience for the participants that engage in the tool. And so we would obviously, as we're setting up that contract with our organizational client, we'll be thinking through some of those risks and how we might manage that. I think you're absolutely right. We wouldn't want to share aggregate data. But I know so many organizations that we're working with right now, and having just read the most recent UN mental health strategy that was released, looking at ways of assessing, having data to help inform our planning for staff well-being. That's such valuable information. And so we'll really be working with the organization to think about, as we're seeing patterns, as we're seeing trends, as we're seeing what is coming out of the data, we'll be thoughtful about how we might want to present that so it can help inform your choices when you're coming up with your well-being plan, staff care plan for your team or for your whole entire organization. Really important. Right now, because we have such our sample size, we're continuing to collect data. Maybe that's where you were going, Lisa, as we collect all of our data of all of the organizations and clients that we're serving, that it's really helping us to kind of create some normative samples there to glean some trends and learnings that we can share with the entire sector.
I have been fascinated to see the data as our pool grows, to see some of the data emerging, and particularly some of what I'm spotting in the different. There's a question in there that asks whether you are living in what you would consider your home country or whether you are living outside your home country. So looking at the differences there, and they're showing up in the data. And those living outside their home countries in the sample sizes we have at the moment are often showing up with lower scores on those resilience factors, and I'm fascinated by that. I'm going to just drop something in the chat too, and on this question about advising teams on improvements, we have another survey that we are able to run with teams, with client teams, and that's called the Staff Care Pulse Survey. And while the KIRB is really designed to help individuals reflect on their personal resilience and action plan in that arena, the Staff Care Pulse Survey is designed to be used with teams, and it does have, and then the results are designed to be shared with teams. And it looks a little bit at it looks at the 10 factors in the KIRB in an abbreviated way. It also looks at the drivers of burnout, and it looks at team preferences for topics that they're particularly interested in terms of staff care development. So if anyone on here has questions about the Staff Care Pulse Survey, feel free to reach out by email, and I can let you know more about that as well.
Lisa, we have a question from Beth about, can we say more about the training that's offered?
Sure. So currently we have several ways we structure training after using the KIRB. One is teams take the KIRB and then participate in a single 90-minute workshop. The second option is teams take the KIRB and participate in a 4-hour team workshop. And the third option is teams take the KIRB and participate in a series of 3 90-minute workshops. So there's obviously a difference in what we can cover between 90 minutes and 4 hours. The 90-minute version is really an introduction to how to interpret the tool, to how to think about resilience, to how to, and that introduction to thinking about the continuum of self-care strategies, and positioning high-risk coping sort of within that normal range of human experience, but also helping people to think more, to gain more awareness in that area, and then guiding people to think through their individual reports and what action planning they might want to do. In the 4-hour workshop, we cover a similar territory, but in an expanded format with more interactivity, which the groups and the teams love. The chance to get into small group discussions to discuss themes and trends, the chance to practice some skill building exercises that research suggests really report resilience, and chance to hear a little bit more about why they work and to actually practice them in session. So that's the way we've structured training around the KIRB at the moment. And then with teams who are taking this every year, we actually look at the team results in advance of the workshop. So once they've done the introductory sort of suite and they're quite familiar with the tool, we can look at the results and go, oh, okay, so across the team, here is where we're seeing the lowest scores on this factor. And let's pick up that thread this year, and we'll also build in a bit more in-depth material on action planning or breaking and making habits and things like that. So using the results to guide the development. And we have here a question here from Jane. Do these team trainings often lead to individual coaching? I would love to see that happening. I think we're still early enough that we can't make a statement on that with regards to often, but I think that this is a really powerful tool to carry into coaching. And I think coaching is an incredibly powerful process to actually open up space for real and meaningful change. So I would say we would love to see this tool lead into individual coaching, and I can see it being a natural fit. That hasn't yet been the way that the teams we're working with have chosen to use the tool, but I could see that being a good fit. Tim, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, and oftentimes I find that the conversation might invite somebody to think about going into more counseling experience as well as coaching. So, we're very careful that we want to understand what are the benefits that an organization has in place, whether it's through KonTerra or through another vendor for their employee assistance program. So we want to make sure that we're, creating opportunities to reflect on that, how they would access that support and help them be more knowledgeable. So there's a lot of mental health literacy that kind of comes out of these conversations as well. One thing I was thinking about, Lisa, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are. Um, I see a couple of folks on the call today that are in that more organizational development, organizational resilience lane. And so I was thinking about how the KIRB might be very useful if you had a group of leaders, managers, thinking about, where their own resilience is as a team, or hearing, more about perhaps if that aggregate data can be shared. What does, where are some of the ways that on an organizational level we can think about creating some change if we find that, gosh, a large representative sample has a lowered meaning and purpose in their work. What does that mean?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is a powerful tool in that context, both when thinking about um, the meta issues, like the one you just named about what does it signal if you see a score that's a bit lower than you might hope for meaning and purpose across an entire team, or a positive outlook.
Mm-hmm.
Because often we see those two tend to hang, then they don't track, they're not perfectly correlated, but you often see them hanging together. When one starts to dip, the other starts to dip. And yeah, what does that mean for the work context, the work culture, the work environment? So I think you could absolutely use the tool to come at that. And also, if everybody across the team has really low scores on rest and relaxation, what does that mean around how work is being structured in ways that create space and permission to take time to implement boundaries? And the boundaries is another issue that we often talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And with leadership, I particularly would love to pick up that theme, not just in terms of the broader work environment, but in terms of people's the power that managers and leaders have to influence work culture and context through modeling.
Mm-hmm.
So whether managers and leaders are walking the talk, they might be saying staff care is important, um, health and well-being is important. Are they making decisions in their own lives in that reflect those messages? Because that is very, very powerful and
Mm-hmm.
influences what leaders and managers are actually doing, influences culture in general far more than what they're saying. So helping them use the tool to think through that dynamic as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're
I think
1 minute away from, and we want to respect everybody's time. But thank you to everybody who has made time to be here today, and to anybody watching this recording. Though there's a number of people, there's several dozen people who couldn't be here for whatever reason, but will receive the recording. So thank you for your time. Reach out to us if you have additional questions. We would love to hear from you, and all the best as you head into the end of the week.
Thank you, everyone. Lisa, wonderful to be with you again. Thanks so
You too.
much.
Thanks, Tim. Always a pleasure.